Hi everyone, welcome back to Stephan Livera podcast, brought to you by swan.com, the best place to buy Bitcoin. Joining me today is the lead of Payjoin Dev Kit, and also I believe this project, and you are sponsored by Spiral and OpenSat. So Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Stefan. Can't wait to get into it.
So I know there has been a bit of discussion recently about the state of Bitcoin privacy. Obviously, some of the recent news with the arrest of the founders of Samurai Wallet and of Wasabi exiting the US. There's been a lot of discussion. Okay, where do people go now for privacy, and what does it mean for Bitcoin privacy? So, do you want to just start with that? Start on if you have any broader comment about what's happening there.
Yeah, it's of course been very difficult to see one after another developer have a target on their back. Especially if what they're working on is open source software that gives people the freedom to selectively reveal their activity to whatever counterparty they want. I think the approach that a lot of this tech has been taking is one that we knew would not last forever. A lot of people had concerns. Of course, I hope that the powers that be see that this tech is speech acts. The deployment of the tech is just an act of speaking. But I think we need to change Bitcoin in the cultural, systemic way we use it if we're going to have reliable privacy for the long term. Where a lot of these attacked pieces of software are specific applications that someone who has a particular interest in privacy might use, it would be better if as a ecosystem of independent applications and software, there were some reason for us to use privacy tech to save money or to scale Bitcoin that had ripple effects over the whole ecosystem. And I think that's where we're definitely headed.
I see, yeah. And of course, I mean, free the Samurai guys and free the Tornado Cash guys as far as I'm concerned, but it certainly could contribute to a chilling effect in the US or even outside of the US, given what's happening. But of course, there's fighting back, right? There's some fighting back that's happening at a political and legal level, but there's also developers who are writing open source code, and that open source code could, as you were saying, go into some of these Bitcoin wallets and Bitcoin apps in such a way that it's not like the only user of this app is someone looking for privacy. There may be efficiency or scaling reasons, or just it's a better UX, like it's just a better experience to use that app. So let's talk a bit about that. Obviously, we're going to talk a bit about the Payjoin Dev Kit, but do you want to just start with the background for us? What is a Payjoin?
So a Payjoin is the simplest way for two people to cooperate to make one transaction. So I want to send you some Bitcoin. You want to consolidate some of your unspent outputs, because as you use Bitcoin over time, if you're receiving money, you have to eventually spend that, and every single output needs to be included in a transaction to be spent. And if you spend it at a time when it's expensive to include things in the blockchain, you're going to incur more fees than if you periodically consolidate. So
yeah,
because
so let's just before we go further, I just want to make sure we've explained it obviously. Okay. I understand you get this, and probably many listeners do, but just to make sure everyone can follow along, Bitcoin transactions are made up of inputs and outputs. Those inputs are consumed in the transaction, and it's like, as an example, let's say I pay you just in a standard transaction. That transaction might have one input on my side, one input from my wallet, and it might have two outputs, as an example. One output going to you, and then the second output in that case might be a change output coming back to me. So the analogy for listeners who are not familiar, you can think of it like, it's notes in your wallet, right? Like if I'm going to pay you, $26 as an example, I might need to pull out a $20 note, a $5 note, and a $1 note to be able to pay you in this kind of analogy. And so what you're talking about there is our Bitcoin wallets in a Payjoin context are maybe going to coordinate who's contributing the inputs to that transaction. So do you want to just take it from there and elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so like you said, Bitcoin transactions have these inputs and outputs. And in the original white paper, Satoshi actually saw that this was a problem for privacy. This is the only problem related to privacy that's left in the white paper, that if I'm going to make a transaction, I'm going to contribute all of the inputs. So anyone looking at that transaction on the public ledger is going to know that those inputs came from the same person. So that's called common input ownership assumption. And the way to fix that is by constructing transactions where more than one person contribute inputs. And PayJoin is the very simplest way to do that automatically.
Yeah, right. And as you said, the common input ownership heuristic is one of the key privacy destroying assumptions. I think it's probably one of the key things that people are using in terms of if you are an outside observer, right? Because for listeners, obviously I know you get this. For listeners, Bitcoin is a public ledger of transactions. And so anybody who downloads the blockchain can just look at that, or people can even use these Block Explorer websites, and then they can sort of trace where things are going on the chain per se. And so one of the key, now there's a bunch of different heuristics to be clear, right? There's things like the output type heuristic. There's the kind of the numbering of the outputs. There's end sequence numbers. There's all kinds of things. But in terms of the main one that a lot of people use, and to put some context here, this kind of analysis is also, people call it wallet clustering. So the idea is the outside observer, chain analyst person, might try to look at those flows on the chain and sort of identify, oh, okay, I can sort of see there's a cluster of these coins that have maybe come from this particular direction. And so by using this PayJoin type of technique, it actually helps break that heuristic, because now you can't necessarily know, just because these outputs were spent at the same time, they're not necessarily controlled by the same person.
That's right. And very importantly, the types of batches that we do don't look any different from typical activity that's done on chain. So there's a lot of these transactions that use multiple outputs at the same time to fund an output that's maybe bigger than some of the inputs. So if I want to pay you $26, I need to get my $20 note, my $5 note, and my $1 note. You have those inputs to create this this output. So this type of behavior, type of structure that PayJoin makes on chain is covert, and it creates this discrepancy between, is this a naively constructed transaction in the old school way, or is this a PayJoin? So you get this benefit of batching, where because our payment intents are together, we can save some money on the combined intent versus if they were posted independently, because every byte you post to the ledger you need to pay for. And we have this privacy benefit not only to ourselves, but to everyone on the network, because any transaction that could potentially be a PayJoin now has some uncertainty about it. It's more difficult to run a dragnet surveillance system across a network that has that level of uncertainty.
I see, yeah. And so, in other words, it's like the anonymity set is much larger. And from what I've heard from privacy analysts and developers, people like Adam Gibson, aka Waxwing, he's spoken about how you would only need a relatively small amount of Bitcoin transactions to be PayJoins before it's casting doubt on all Bitcoin transactions in terms of their traceability, or casting doubt on the common input ownership heuristic. So I'm curious if you have any thought or reflection on that.
Yeah, everyone wants a number. Everyone's like, what's the number that makes, after what point does Bitcoin have privacy? And of course the answer is complicated. How could it be simple? So the important thing is that when there's a statistically significant number of PayJoin transactions, when you look at any transaction on chain and there's a significant probability that you could be looking at a PayJoin or not, then we're winning. Then this privacy has a strong effect. And it's affected by not only the other people that are using PayJoin, but what wallet you're using, like you said, what other fingerprints you have, connections to other people who might be revealing the true nature of a transaction. and removing those privacy properties. So PayJoin is not a fix-all for privacy, but it raises the lower bound on everyone's expected privacy. And this is maybe flip to say, but I think around 5% is considered statistically significant for a lot of circumstances. That's just a rule of thumb. So if there were a 5% chance that your particular transaction was a PayJoin, then that is something that someone tracking that transaction would need to take into consideration and think about.
Yeah, and as we were saying, now it's important, we'll get to the kind of, it's not a silver bullet point as well, but I think the important point to make here is that it really screws with the ability to do clustering, right? So the idea is if the outside observer or the surveillance person is looking on the chain, they have a lot less capability to understand the flows because now there's a significant number of people who are actually using PayJoin in this hypothetical, right? But also, to the point you mentioned, and I think this is something I was commenting on this earlier, that I think we have to get away from this idea of silver bullet thinking, right? This kind of, just this perfect bullet, I load it and I just do this one thing and I'm done. Well, not quite. It's more like there are other ways that you could be de-anonymized, right? It could be through your internet layer. Like what was the IP from which you broadcast that transaction? What was there's all these other things, maybe like timing attack or timing analysis of the volume of coins. Like there's all kinds of other ways that some of these surveillance techniques could be applied. But I think the important point to understand is this could be a really cool tool that moves it forward in a meaningful way. So that's how I'm thinking about it. I'm curious if you're seeing it similarly or differently there.
Yeah, even within the tools that exist, you're going to have incremental changes of efficiency or speed. To me, the most important thing about PayJoin is that it doesn't require a fork to Bitcoin, and wallets can implement it just by changing the way they communicate over the internet. It's application level software. It can be applied to most of the ways people transact in Bitcoin today, and it's compatible with a lot of the other ways people want to use Bitcoin, like Lightning. It just makes the settlement layer more efficient and has privacy as a sort of side effect.
Yeah. And we should also mention, as you were saying before, the benefit is not just privacy, but potentially being able to, let's say, manage your wallet a bit more. So let's say your wallet has, in this analogy, you've got a bunch of different coins. The idea is that wallet can use different inputs to then manage the size of the wallet and the inputs that it has, right?
Yeah, it gives you an opportunity. So you're going to need to do this consolidation no matter what, if you're receiving Bitcoin flows, net receiving. And typically during a PayJoin, a sender is offering you enough fee to cover your consolidation. So you have this free option every time you get offered a PayJoin to make this consolidation and save money in the future. And you also have the opportunity to do really fancy things like transaction cut through, where if I want to send you some money, you don't have to take that into your static address because we're actually interacting over the internet. You can say, actually, I want some of the funds you're sending me to go to my broker who is going to cash me out to fiat. I want some of it to go to my cold storage wallet, and I want some of it to go into this Lightning channel. And then you send that request back to me. I can just check that I'm still paying you and you're not spending more than I'd like to, and you get that efficiency gain.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because then, you could start to kind of jump through hops as well. So that kind of makes it even more confusing from a surveillance perspective. And so I guess summarizing there in terms of this point, it's that it's not just a privacy win, it's also potentially an efficiency gain. And so that's also a really interesting point. Now, there's no free lunch. There are trade-offs. And as I understand, there's more interactivity. So if you could just talk us through some of the downsides and some of the potential pitfalls here around having PayJoin.
When you're talking about implementing a PayJoin in a particular piece of software, I think the efficiency gains are the key point to communicate to your user base. Like, we're doing this because you can save money, not necessarily because you get particular privacy from your counterparty, because it helps the whole network. It's not just about the one person doing PayJoin, which is a difference in the way most people have thought about privacy tech on Bitcoin, where they say, I have Bitcoin, I want to coin join, I want to get privacy. And this is kind of an upgrade that lets us take this trade-off of doing a little more interaction to have efficiency gains and only post a limited transaction that doesn't necessarily reveal all of the characteristics of every single party that was involved in that. But of course, interaction has massive costs. I need to make sure I can send you a message and you can send it back to me. So this is a huge reason that the first versions of PayJoin were not able to take off. People who had wallet software implemented the sender a lot of the time, but didn't implement the receiver because the receiver needed to have a server that was reachable on the open internet. Because when we make a PayJoin, I make a typical transaction and sign it, a basic transaction. We call this the original since it comes from me. I'm the origin in this story. I send that to you. You look at it and says, okay, this pays me, but I want to make it a PayJoin. I'm going to add my input and augment my output by the amount of the input minus fees. You sign that, invalidating my signature, because my original signature was only valid for the complete original transaction. You send it back to me, and then I can check that it follows the rules, and if I like it, I sign it and broadcast it. So there's one round of communication that needs to happen, and that takes time. But we already are doing this to send Lightning payments, for example, all over the place. And what we figured out is that the real bottleneck is not being online most of the time. All of our devices are online. I'm talking to you online right now. It was not difficult for us to make this happen. What's difficult is being online at the same time synchronously. So we can tweak exactly how those messages are passed and use some network privacy techniques and some encryption so that no third party can steal or dissolve the privacy properties, but we can have some third party untrusted server be able to move these messages on our behalf with a new version 2 PayJoin protocol that gets over some of the interactivity challenges.
Okay, great. Yeah, and as you said, I think that's maybe historically why there's not been a lot of wallets that have taken on PayJoin support. So just walking that through a little bit. So as an example, let's say you have an online store. Maybe you have BTC Pay. And actually, I know BTC Pay does have PayJoin support. I remember ticking it on a couple of years ago. But anyway, the idea is, let's say I'm going to pay you. Instead, like as I scan that, if let's say I'm using my phone, I pull out and I scan that, it's got like a little extra bit at the end, denoting that this is a PayJoin, enabled BTC Pay or PayJoin enabled wallet, and then at that point we can sort of, my wallet is going to talk to your BTC Pay or your server and do that process where we kind of hand back and forth the PSBT, I think you come back to me with the new PSBT and I sign that and then broadcast, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And so then let's talk a little bit about, if you have any thoughts on why there hasn't been a lot of PayJoin adoption to now. I think one criticism would be, I've heard people say, oh, look, it's like a science project and whatever. People are kind of talking about it in theory, but people aren't going to use it in practice. Do you have any thought on that?
That's a great sign. If someone's saying what you're working on is a science project, you're probably onto something because they felt they needed to comment and you're experimenting, doing something new. So I think there were at one time incumbents who had competing borderline proprietary software and not completely open spec. There wasn't an open process to move the protocol forward, who were threatened by having an open protocol because it would outcompete their app. And like I said, the original PayJoin spec had some problems, wasn't quite there, and there also wasn't a profit motive for a developer to go and improve this privacy technique where they can't charge a fee for every single PayJoin that gets coordinated, because it's a peer-to-peer thing. That's a network upgrade. It's not a specific application upgrade. There wasn't so much demand, or I guess there wasn't the motivation to supply that, because there's no reward, and that's changed the past 2 years, I'd say. I've been focused on this problem and fortunate enough to get the support of some of these grant giving, open source supporting organizations, and I want to give a shout out to Bob Space in Bangkok and the Human Rights Foundation for supporting this, in addition to Spiral and OpenSats, because they're trying to get this over the line. So there's more and more developers who are trying to make this happen. There are more people who have standards experience working on this. And the other thing was the BIP process was just totally backed up. So the ability for a ecosystem to come to consensus on changes or even discussions around a spec was totally backed up until very recently. And that's changed. So all of those contributed to the PayJoin spec not being ratcheted forward. But in the past year, we've had an upgrade to the underlying specification that's asynchronous and removes the barriers. And we have more collaborators than ever trying to move this forward. And then we also have the PayJoin Dev Kit that lets people take this off-the-shelf library and plug it into their software, so they don't have to worry about implementing all of the PayJoin spec correctly or efficiently. We can all collaborate on this library that everyone can share. Kind of like how Lightning Dev Kit has been able to do that for Lightning across the ecosystem.
Great. And so can you, while we're on the topic of PayJoin Dev Kit, can you explain what is PayJoin Dev Kit, how does it work, and what people can do there?
So software development kits have gone back a long time. You take some common functionality and you put it into a library that has documentation and examples, so people can take that library and plug it into their existing software and get some new functionality without implementing it all themselves. PayJoin Dev Kit does that for PayJoin, for the version 1 and 2 PayJoin spec. It's written in Rust, so we can have a high degree of type safety, and there's a reference implementation that consumes the library, the PayJoin CLI that works with Bitcoin D. It also has the server software to do the version 2, so these mailboxes anyone can run. And because it's in Rust, we're able to bind to it from many other languages. So Bitcoin Xavier is working on Python and Flutter bindings, so anyone can use this common library that we've all been iterating on and tuning to be better and put it into a different programming environment. So the idea is anyone can take this small, correct piece of library code and use it in whatever wallet they want.
Yeah, and that's great to hear. I obviously would love to see PayJoin come to more and more wallets. So you touched on a few things there. You touched on the server mailbox idea. I believe this might be part of the new V2 spec. So maybe you want to just help explain this server mailbox asynchronous
I should really call it a
PayJoin.
directory. I did misspeak, I suppose, by calling it a mailbox. But it's a directory.
So can you explain what the directory is for PayJoin?
Yeah. So version 1 PayJoin, we communicate peer-to-peer. You have a web server, I have a web client, and I send you messages to your server. But what if you don't run a server? What if you're not a sysadmin? Blah, it's just a pain. What if you're on mobile? Then hosting a server is almost impossible. So instead, we can outsource this directory, this functionality to a directory. So the directory is just a box that allows you to register a subdirectory where I can reach you. So if I want to send you a PayJoin, if you want me to send you a PayJoin, you first talk to the subdirectory, which is known to your wallet or configured, and you say, hey, I want a subdirectory. It says, okay, this is your public key for the subdirectory. You can then send me the URL of that directory server slash subdirectory, and I now have enough information to do a key exchange with you, encrypt messages that only you can see, but put them in this subdirectory folder so we can speak back and forth. That's the basic idea. And by both having that subdirectory and then making the protocol so we don't need to respond right away, we can have this asynchronous communication that's effective even on mobile. So receivers don't need to host a server anymore.
Back to the show in a moment. This show brought to you by CoinKite.com, the creators of the best Bitcoin hardware security devices, such as the Cold Card Mark IV and the new Cold Card Q. Now, we use Bitcoin hardware security devices to keep our keys offline, our private keys offline. Now, the way these work is you can do that setup, write down your 12 or 24 words on the seed word cards, and keep that secure. Now, you can use this device to interact with the Bitcoin network using software such as Sparrow Wallet, Electrum, or Vector Desktop, or Nunchuck as a few examples. Now, you have a range of security features that you can use with these devices, such as passphrases, you can use seed XOR, or my favorite is multi-signature. Now, if you're starting in a basic way, just start with the device and the USB-C cable, plug it directly to the computer and use it that way, and then later improve your setup. But I believe these devices are great at helping secure your coins, especially as you start to migrate up into multi-signature security. But don't be disheartened or don't be scared away. They are accessible, and I think you actually do learn about Bitcoin in the process. So to get yours, go to coinkite.com, use code Livera to get a discount on your cold card. This show also brought to you by mempool.space, the leading Bitcoin and blockchain visualizer. I use it all the time when I'm checking transaction fees and trying to understand what is the state of Bitcoin's mempool. You can search transactions, historical as well as unconfirmed ones, and also see a great way to visualize things across the Lightning Network, Liquid, mining, and so much more. Also, for those of you with an enterprise, they offer a mempool.space enterprise program. So for those of you as part of that enterprise program, you might want to get increased API limits, and you might want to have increased access to the team in terms of feature requests. You might want to have special branding in terms of how your custom instance of mempool.space looks. So to sign up for that, go to mempool.space/enterprise. The lead sponsor of this show is Swan.com, and Swan has a mission to onboard millions of people into Bitcoin. I also work at Swan, helping on some educational content for the team. Now, the team have also put out a new version of the Swan Bitcoin application, which is available on your smartphone, whether it's Apple or Android. Now, this app has a really fast onboarding experience. It's now just a few minutes to go from zero to Bitcoin. So if you are standing there with your family or friends and you might have been having trouble trying to get them onboarded, well, try this now. Recommend Swan Bitcoin. And you can do this while you're standing next to them. They can click through, and most of them will be able to set up and do this in just a few minutes. Also, the team at Swan have rolled out a new promotion. There are zero fees on your first $10,000 of Bitcoin buys. So this is a great way to go from zero to Bitcoin, and in a guided and managed way. So reminder, go to your App Store or Play Store and search Swan Bitcoin to get onboarded with Bitcoin today. And now, back to the show. Okay, great. So a few questions there. Just on the asynchronous aspect, you mentioned we don't both have to be online, right? So one of us doesn't have to run a web server. We could both be mobile users. What kind of time thresholds are we working with here, just like as a default? Are we talking like within a day and then it times out? Or is it just kind of like, actually, it's always going to be valid? You know what I mean?
I think within a day makes the most sense. And this is a configuration option that both the directory and the receiver would be able to coordinate with. There hasn't been enough feedback yet to know for sure what the number is, but I think 24 hours is a typical Lightning invoice expiration. I think that makes sense in this context too.
Gotcha. Yeah. And just to explain a little bit of context for maybe listeners who are newer, in the kind of older days of Bitcoin, now this is not a recommended practice, but there were people who would use a static address as an example, or even if they weren't using a static address, they might sort of tell someone, let me generate a new address in my phone wallet, give it to the other person, and they just pay it whenever, right? Because that's kind of how things work on chain. It's just kind of a long-lived Bitcoin address. You don't have to think about expiry or anything like that. And so then moving into the Lightning context, it became more about, okay, we've got these Lightning invoices and they expire, but then people find other ways around that and using like, Lightning address and LNURL and maybe in the future Bolt 12. So there's some of these different ideas around that. But I guess in this case, it would be a little more, you're time boxing it, maybe so that that server, that directory doesn't have to like just kind of retain data for forever, right? And also the theoretically that transaction might go stale anyway, because people might come and kind of propose a transaction and then go away and never actually do it, right? So I guess the other question I've got is around who would run a directory, right? Are you thinking of that similar to, the people who run an Electrum server right now? Or is it kind of like people are going to have their, their Raspberry Blitz or their Umbrel or something, and they can run a directory on that, and it's like an app they would install on their, on their node? Who is going to run directories, and what's going to be the model for that?
Bitcoin transactions are small most of the time. Think how crappy an inscription image looks if you go look at some Explorer for that. We're talking under 10 kilobytes. So these are not expensive servers to run and store this data for 24 hours. And they're one-time use. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to abuse this server to put a really crappy 7 kilobyte image somewhere that someone can only fetch once. If you communicate a key out of band, which you're already probably doing over encryption, like it just doesn't, it's low cost and it's only single purpose. So right now, payjoin.org is running one as part of the dev kit process, but I want to encourage anyone who wants to run one of these for their community, get in touch, because it's not crazy expensive to do.
Yeah, I see. And so then, as an example,
a Nostr relay,
right,
or a VPN service might be interested in adding this as a sort of add-on to their product suite. And wallets, if they support PayJoin, want to make sure they have reliable directories, so they could either run one or perhaps partner with a secondary wallet to make sure one of them has this directory server running, the PayJoin directory running, and the other runs an oblivious HTTP relay. So there's another issue I didn't mention directly, which is that if you're communicating with a third-party server, that third-party server is going to know your IP address. And in the past, we've used Tor or VPNs to communicate with them, but Tor is very heavy and VPNs are sort of optional. So there's this new tech coming out of Cloudflare and Mozilla and Apple that's related to Apple's private relay, which is a sort of one-hop Tor circuit that can be used by default. So the only way you can communicate with this directory server is through an oblivious HTTP relay. It's 80% of the benefit of Tor with 20% of the effort, and you need both of those servers to be run by people in the community. So right now, some of the entities I mentioned before, I'm not going to mention exactly who, run the oblivious HTTP relays, and I'm running the PayJoin directory, but the code is all open source, and I'm happy to help anyone else run one. We do need more of these things to be running.
Yeah, interesting. And it's interesting you mentioned Nostr as well, because there's a bunch of people who are thinking of Nostr as a way to sort of coordinate things. I've heard of ideas like Joinstra and different ideas out there. And then presumably, I mean, we might get to a point in the future where in your wallet, some wallets have a setting where you can have a manual Electrum server. Maybe you could have like a manual, here's my PayJoin directory, here's my whatever that I would like to use. And, that can be like a manual setting that people have, but maybe it has like some kind of safe defaults for the new user, right? In the same way that, like, I don't know, if you use like Sparrow today, it has some default Electrum servers in there, something like that.
The cool thing about the directory servers is that they're only getting encrypted blobs and they're not even getting your IP address. So they don't have much information to correlate. You don't have to trust them with almost anything. It would be difficult to even conduct a timing attack, some intersection attack. They get so little information. So it's feasible that someone could run something like that in their wallet that just pops up.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, well, that sounds great. While we're on the topic of V2 protocol, is there anything else you want to mention in terms of PayJoin V2 versus the V1?
Yeah, I want to touch back on Nostr first. A lot of people want to use Nostr for this because there are already relay servers all over the world. The issue with Nostr is that it doesn't protect network privacy and it uses WebSocket. So because it uses WebSocket, you can't use something like Oblivious HTTP, and you would need to fall back on something like Tor, and that's really difficult to make a default. So the version 2 protocol focuses on two things. It really focuses on the one thing, which is to make PayJoin asynchronous. But to make that safe, we also need to have network privacy. So it includes this oblivious HTTP dependency. Now, I mentioned some encryption and authentication, and that's all done using cryptographic primitives that are already even in core. So we get rid of transport layer security, web, HTTPS, that thing, and replace it with something called hybrid pub key encryption. So like I said, you give me, if you're gonna request a PayJoin from me, you give me your public key, and I have enough information just from that to derive secret keys that we can use to communicate with. And we can encrypt payloads, and we can have authenticated payloads where we have a high degree of certainty that a certain payload came from the correct counterparty that had the keys. And because we use those cryptographic primitives that are in core, whereas TLS is not, it's feasible to get something like this into Bitcoin Core with sufficient engineering effort. It's possible that someone has an objection, but based strictly on dependencies, the spec is built to be compatible with the types of software that everyone using Bitcoin already has.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I wasn't aware about that. So, yeah, it's pretty interesting then. It makes it even more appealing, really. So, in terms of other downside trade-offs or kind of who's it makes sense for, if we're moving into a world, okay, maybe for now it's still kind of, people can still do things on chain, but maybe over time it's going to become more and more, you're going to need to be rich to be transacting on chain. And so does that mean, the user for this needs to be somebody it needs to be a hot wallet, right? Like that's the other trade-off, right? The receiver.
Well, the reason why did it need to be a hot wallet? It needed to be a hot wallet in version 1 because the protocol was synchronous. So because when I send you a request, you needed to get back to me right away, it needed to be hot. But with an asynchronous protocol, that's not the case any longer. I can send you a request, you have 24 hours to take your signing device out and sign a response and send it back to me, and then I can do the same. So the asynchronous nature really opens up the possibilities to improve the settlement layer.
I see. Okay, yeah, well, that makes it definitely a lot more interesting. And so, I mean, it's still going to not be as kind of practical as just kind of or like, let's say, in the old school way where people just kind of had one single address. There's no kind of, you're just paying that. But maybe it would be like a batch operation thing. Like maybe somebody is kind of collecting a bunch of these PayJoin things, going away, signing them all, and sending back. But in terms of who would, I guess, be the ideal user here, are you thinking just everyday users, merchants? Do you have any ideas on that? Who would be the main users here?
It is settlement more than payment. So it's people who are moving Bitcoin on chain regularly. And the people who do that the most are exchanges right
maybe
now.
Yeah.
So by offering this, and it's important to also remember this is the very first, well, it's the second now, it's the second iteration of the sort of batching we can do. I don't think we're limited to just two parties doing this, but it's a great way to start. The PayJoin is the simplest form of batching, the transaction structure itself. There are ways to batch with more, and exchanges are already doing this batching because it's inexpensive engineering effort relative to the benefit they gain. If an exchange receives a PayJoin, they can use the cut-through mechanism I talked to earlier to receive a deposit and pay out a withdrawal in the same transaction. They can have the senders pay for their transaction fees. I think they stand the most to gain relative to the engineering effort. And once some payment processor has this, maybe some of these exchanges share payment processor infrastructure. like open infrastructure. And then also anyone who's receiving Bitcoin on a regular basis on chain, whether it's a Lightning node operator or someone who's funded by grants, having this option gives you a way to optimize what you're posting to chain automatically in the background. You really don't have to mess around. The software can support it, and it can just take their request. If it doesn't support PayJoin, you can just pay the person's address. If they do support PayJoin and they're online, you can make a PayJoin, and if it fails, you're no worse off than you were before. It's an optimistic interaction, and if it fails, you just fall back to the old ways.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so, I mean, people talk about the privacy aspect, but I mean, what you're talking about there is actually also really cool from a scaling perspective, right? Because you're kind of off, to a limited extent, you're off-chain scaling because you're skipping out transactions that would have otherwise hit the chain. And so you're kind of able to batch things in a really interesting way that kind of makes it more private and more scalable. So I think it's actually a pretty big win from that perspective in terms of like just a fee savings perspective.
Yeah, I don't know how you've thought about is the biggest, like, what is the biggest hurdle for wallet developers to have this? I think it is the correctness, like ensuring you have this thing right and then having a reason to do it because you have to know that other people have also implemented it.
Yeah, I think it's that. And if I had to, I mean, I'm not an expert myself, but I would say, if I had to guess, I think it's just that it's a whole new flow type, right? It's the same for the same reason that Lightning adoption wasn't like super high in the early days, and it's arguably not very high today. In certain communities, in certain contexts, it is high, but I think it's just like a whole new thing. And I think that's what maybe turned a lot of people off, or maybe it just felt like the UX hurdle, the user experience hurdle was just a bit harder. But I'm sort of thinking of V1, right? Like V2, actually, from what you're explaining to me, sounds a lot better. So, I think it's more just about, maybe wallet developers maybe aren't as aware about all the benefits. Hopefully they take another look.
Yeah, payjoin.org is the executive summary. It shows you kind of how it works, who supports it, what it takes, and it's being improved.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity, who supports it currently? Are there wallets that that already using PayJoin Dev Kit?
There are wallets using the PayJoin Dev Kit. So Bitmask and Mutiny both support sending PayJoins. The version 1 with the PayJoin Dev Kit. The version 2 is only supported by our reference implementation right now, but there's an open PR to support it on Mutiny. So Mutiny, you're listening to this, merge the PR. The PayJoin CLI it lets you do this on Bitcoin D, of course. And there's also some software for LND that was experimental that used this to let you open channels in a PayJoin, but it's not supported any longer. There are around 10 wallets total that support PayJoin, and the PDK, like I said, is used in those two. The other thing about version 2 is that it is backwards compatible with version 1. So if you have a version 2 receiver and you're online, the version 1 sender will try to make a PayJoin with you and can succeed if you're online. If you're offline, in the V2 case, you would just wait. If you're offline in the V1 case, it fails, but you at least have that optimistic interactive path available with the V2.
Gotcha, yeah. And then I'm thinking, so as you've explained it, I think the exchange use case really makes a lot of sense there, right? Especially if they want to start, doing that cut through stuff. Maybe the harder part would be like if a merchant was going to try to use this, because maybe now they've got to start dealing, as an example, think about failure modes, right? If customer pays the wrong amount, or customer needs a refund, or or the customer sort of tries it and they're worried that maybe the wallet didn't support it correctly or do it correctly. Maybe that's a concern. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Is this different from correctness of implementation? This is related to the invoicing and like merchant specific user experience you're talking about, right?
Yeah, right. I'll give you another example, right? Sometimes when you try to add new things into that same QR, the QR codes, the scanners, right? Like, so let's say if the user has like an older phone, maybe their QR code won't, their reader won't read it as well. That's something I heard people say when you try, in certain cases with even like Bit21 trying to have like Lightning and Bitcoin in the one QR, to have like a unified QR, but it's a bigger QR. So now maybe certain devices won't be as good at scanning, that kind of thing. Maybe it's related to that. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're going to know until we're talking to those users pay joining very frequently, which since I've been speaking to merchant PayJoin users, their biggest gripe is that other people don't support it. And then most of the ones I've spoken to actually do most of their business over Lightning. So it's from the point of sale perspective, the PayJoin is less important to them than maybe on their exchange side when they're doing settlements, when they're moving money to buy inventory, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it could be that. Like, I mean, it could just be. I mean, and again, that comes back to what we were saying before about, look, in general, lower value commerce is going to move to Lightning, right? So maybe PayJoin has a bigger impact for larger transactions, right? Like, it just kind of, it's sort of obvious, right? So maybe that's where the focus has to be. But I mean, there's a lot of cases where it might be handy for everyday users who are using an exchange, right? Even as an example, let's say you're an everyday user who has to sell some Bitcoin to pay your bills, and you're about to send some to the exchange. It would be cool to have PayJoin in that scenario, in that context, right? So let's say you're setting it up in your Spectre, your Sparrow, your Nunchuck, or Electrum or something, and if the exchange supported PayJoin and had their own, ran all that infrastructure, at that point, if your wallet coordinates with them and you do a PayJoin with an exchange, that could be useful for you, or it could be useful for the exchange too.
Yeah, and then you get flagged by the exchange as someone who has this PayJoin capability in their wallets, and they don't know what to do looking at your transactions, your other ones. They know, okay, this person can PayJoin, but is every transaction a PayJoin? Yeah, and it also does couple with Lightning really well. So if you're opening channels, if I was going to send you some Bitcoin and you knew you wanted a channel in advance, you could do that cut through to open that channel, or hopefully we can make it with splicing. It does seem possible to me. No one has implemented it yet, but it's feasible. So if you were to, send you a payment that adds liquidity to your existing Lightning channel, it increases the value of that or removes it.
Yeah, that could be really cool, because then I'm saving on-chain fees myself, right? Like if I'm taking a payment and I want to resize my Lightning channel up, I mean, that could be a really cool example as well. So, I think there's a lot of benefits to this, but it just seems like maybe people either don't know about it, or maybe the people who do know, I don't know, maybe they think it's too hard or it's not worth it yet. I'm not quite sure, but I would like to see more people use this, to be honest. I think it would be a really cool thing. So, let's see. So I think those are kind of the main questions I had. Any other? I guess in terms of like, I guess you were touching on this as well. In terms of failure modes, you were kind of saying like basically it's just there's V2, and if it doesn't work, you fall back to V1, and that's right. That's it, isn't it?
Yeah, that requires. So if you try to make a PayJoin, to me, I have your original transaction that I can broadcast at any time. So if I don't broadcast that, you want to send the transaction on your own, out of band, or it's kind of in limbo and this person can take that from you whenever. There's another concern I think you had, which was, could someone probe my wallet for my UTXOs? So like, right, if I'm a receiver and they make PayJoin requests to me, are they trying to figure out what outputs I have that I augment? Yeah. And I guess the answer is yes, but we have mechanisms to prevent this. So because someone's sending a receiver a PayJoin proposal, an original PSBT has that spendable PSBT, the receiver can spend that at any time and get paid and not be super concerned. So there's a cost to providing the response that includes your outputs. And then the other thing is, even if your counterparty knows your outputs, they'd know when you consolidate otherwise if you assume common input ownership heuristic holds, which it does right now. by and large. So we're no worse off by adding this PayJoin functionality from that perspective of privacy, because the UTXO you would supply to consolidate would probably be consolidated later anyhow. And when that consolidation happens, the cross input ownership heuristic would hold, and you'd be broken.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got two other ideas actually. One is just around understanding the fees before the user broadcasted, right? So in this case, let's say the user wants to do PayJoin V2. Let's say you have it enabled, you've got the server, you've got the directory, etc. Everything works okay. Do I see the fees before I broadcast the transaction? Like, would that just generally be... Now, maybe that's on my side, on the wallet that I'm using to kind of show me that. Is it... Because this might be a little bit hairy for some users, because maybe I'm gonna have to pay a little bit more than if I just didn't do a PayJoin at all. Is that possible? But it's kind of like you have to think about the holistic long-term experience for that user, and maybe consolidating his wallet is actually saving him in the long run, right?
These decisions can be made for the user by the wallet, made on behalf of the user by the wallet.
Right. Yeah.
With some strong opinions. Sure, a power user could get really nitty gritty and construct the PSPT themselves, but the only decision that a user really needs to make, and Yashraj and I from the Bitcoin design community built this document called the PayJoin Experience that goes through exactly this problem, where all a sender needs to do is pick a budget that they're willing to spend to make a transaction happen, which is the same as when you're spending a naive transaction now. You say, I want to target a certain sats per byte, a certain confirmation time, and I'm willing to pay this much for it. And that's enough information for the sender and the receiver software to negotiate a PayJoin. If the PayJoin fails, typically that original transaction is not going to pay as much. And then if it succeeds, you'll pay for the one additional input from the receiver. The receiver will pay for anything more than that. So if you did transaction cut through, if you added a whole bunch of inputs to a batch, the receiver would be expected to pay for that by custom. And all that is checked on the sender software. So this can be completely abstracted away from a human looking at a phone.
Gotcha. Yeah. And basically, I guess for the everyday end user, it's kind of, don't worry, wallets are going to handle all this in the background. And in practice, as you were saying, if you're going to add in all these inputs to the transaction, I guess the convention, the custom would be, well, if you're going to add all these inputs, you should pay for it, kind of thing. Like, you pay for it out of your side, not put that onto, let's say, the customer side or the sender side.
And the software by default enforces that. You could write custom software that breaks that, but it's kind of like policy in Bitcoin.
Right.
Where if everyone's following this, things just kind of work smoothly. And if not, you get an error message, and that's fine. You can still send a regular transaction if the person doesn't want the PayJoin. Because just adding one input is not that expensive relative to the complete size of the transaction. We're talking about maybe 20% of the total transaction cost in the worst case.
Another area that has been interesting to me recently is silent payments, as an example. So I'm actually going to be getting those guys on soon as well for an episode about that. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what other technologies, privacy techniques, could help from a privacy perspective, right? Like, I mean, let me just explain the silent payments case. The idea is you could have like a Bitcoin username, and you just kind of take payments to that, and you're giving the outside chain surveillance person less of a starting point, right? Because historically, if you just had a public Bitcoin address, then they kind of know where to start, right? They kind of know, I start from this address and I trace it out. But as an example, like hypothetically, imagine we had broad adoption of silent payments, and we also had broad adoption of PayJoin. That would probably already, just those two pieces, if it was broadly adopted, could really move the needle in terms of Bitcoin privacy, in terms of at least not being apparent on-chain to outside observers.
Yeah, they're both systemic updates to the way everyone uses the system. They provide a lot of help, but we do need to get the wallets to integrate them. You could use a silent payment with a public PayJoin address with some tweaks to the way things were expired. I'm so stoked to see them have the success they're having, getting into a couple wallets now, people using them. And they went a slightly different direction. They solved a different problem, but they got rid of interaction for compute. And I think that's if you can do that anytime you want to make that decision.
Yeah.
Going beyond
So I guess
that,
just broadly, yeah, do you have any other ideas in terms of what other pieces would help from a privacy
yeah,
perspective?
going beyond that, I think we really need to look at how to get differential sort of privacy on Bitcoin. We've been in this anonymity set mode of thinking for a long time, which comes from academic research about privacy of networks, like information sent over a network in relation to mixnets. But with Bitcoin, there's so much state that is permanent, and there's values associated with the state. It's a big database, and I guess differential privacy is where you jumble the database itself so that if one person's information is discovered, it doesn't de-anonymize the other people. This is what's used for census information, for example. So this is really standard privacy approach when a lot of people's public information is at stake, and we can achieve that on Bitcoin probably by creating these batched database updates, which is what the CoinJoin techniques are generally. But rather than have it be this manual process where people want to get privacy, really preserve their privacy against an adversary, to only selectively reveal themselves, like that's just expensive. It makes a lot more sense if we can batch our payments that we're making anyway, because we have this cost savings associated. And then PayJoin's the simplest way with two people. It should be possible to have more than two people come together to make one of these batched payments to both save money and then get privacy. There's one other point about the types of privacy I want to mention. So when we think of CoinJoin, Chaumian CoinJoin, blind signature CoinJoin, anonymous credential CoinJoin privacy, we're talking about a few people get together, they put some Bitcoin into this CoinJoin, and they get some Bitcoin out that's approximately the same amount minus fees, but their output is indistinguishable from everyone else's output. So they have privacy from the second party to the transaction. They have privacy from every other person that participated in that and the coordinator. They don't know what output they have. They also have third-person privacy where a dragnet, someone who didn't participate, doesn't know what happened. PayJoin only has this third-person privacy property where it creates this indistinguishability between a regular payment and a PayJoin for a third-person onlooker. But if you and I are both participating to the PayJoin, we know exactly what happened inside that. When we add a third or nth person to a PayJoin, we can get rid of that second person privacy leak while having these other benefits of PayJoin. But it's a matter of, at least the way I've conceived of it now, it's a matter of interaction. Perhaps we can come up with an asynchronous way to depend on more compute instead of interaction. That would be amazing.
Interesting, yeah. And so in a way, in that let's say more than two-person model, does the directory become kind of like a CoinJoin coordinator in a sense, like being a PayJoin coordinator, sort of?
It could. I don't know if you would just rely on the directory, or you would be able to have some other peer-to-peer protocol, or you would need a broadcast network where I can send messages to a group of people I know beforehand, and I can reliably recognize whether they got it or not. We probably need both broadcast and pairwise communication, because if you and I are both participating in this multi-party PayJoin, and I pay you some money, but I don't know what output you actually get or what outputs you get, then I need some confirmation from you, authenticated, that this is from Stephan and he definitely got paid, because I don't know anything other than that in the transaction. That's the ideal.
So yeah, so there's maybe
you
a
don't
bit
know
less
my
certainty.
Inputs. I don't know your outputs. I just know that you got paid what you asked for.
Right, yeah. So it's kind of like how Rusty from, Blockstream talks about proof of payment, right? He was really keen on having this proof of payment concept. So yeah, really interesting stuff. So look, I think that's probably a good spot to wrap up here. So I'll just summarize. PayJoin is this technique that could improve privacy and scalability in terms of Bitcoin's transactions. There's a PayJoin Dev Kit that wallet developers can use. It's a library that they can use to integrate PayJoin into their wallets. It'd be great if more people, get into this, start using it. I think it would be really cool to see. So everyone follow Dan, and find the website again is payjoindevkit.org. Dan, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Stephan.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it out there with your family and friends. Check out my website at stephanlivera.com, and I will see you in the Citadels.